Good evening. My name is Abbas Milani. Welcome to the one before the last event of our quarter. It's been a rather eventful quarter. And the last event will be on December 3rd, Thursday, same place. Saeed Golkar will be talking about his new book called The Basij. It is easily the most comprehensive discussion of how Basij is organized, how they train, what their ideology is, and how they're used to implement social control in Iran. So that is on December 3rd. We have a number of events coming up for next quarter. If you are not on our list, I strongly suggest you put your name so that you can get updates. We are tentatively announcing a conference that we are going to organize on January 14th. It is to announce the arrival of the collection of papers by Hushangi Golshiri. All his private papers, all his notes are now here. There are 24 boxes. We are going to soon open it for scholars to do research on it, and in order to celebrate it, we are organizing a conference. We are inviting several people from inside Iran. Golshiri's son, Barbad Golshiri, Farzaneh Tahiri, who is herself a very accomplished critic and translator and heads the Golshiri Foundation in Iran. She'll be coming. We're inviting several people from outside Iran as well. The list will be finalized hopefully by next week. So that would be, I think, a major event in terms of analysis of Golshiri's work, who I think is one of the most influential writers of his generation. We are very happy to be welcoming Mr. Afshar here. Professor Afshar now teaches East Coast in the University of Massachusetts. He is a local. He is trained partially around here, partially in Los Angeles. He has a master's in animation. Some of his work has been exhibited in some of the most prestigious places for this kind of art. When I was looking at a couple of his animations on Rostam, the idea that Rostam, our cultural icon, would be talking to a drug addict in the streets was in the beginning a little bit jarring. I thought, wow, Mr. Bezai is going to complain about this one. So why are you making fun of about Rostam? And then I remembered that Obeid Zakani makes fun of Rostam. Rostam Mutawarikh makes fun of Rostam. And Feridun Hoveyda says, unless we get over our Rostam complex, we will never have democracy in Iran. So this might be the beginning of the burgeoning of democracy in Iran right here. So welcome, Professor Afshar.
So thank you, Mr. Milani. Good evening. Thanks for coming. Just to clarify, I'm not trying to make fun of Rostam anyhow. It's basically exploring in that realm and bringing Rostam to see what type of satire we can create in the modern Iran. I'm here today to talk briefly about animation in Iran, and especially after the revolution, as well as my own animated series, Rostam in Wonderland, and its concerns. Just a little bio of where I come from. I was born and raised in Iran in the early 80s. Went to a very well corrupted, destructive education system in Iran. Finished high school, moved to the United States, went to Cal Arts and UCLA, studied animation and digital media, and now I'm developing the animation program at the University of Massachusetts Lowell in close to Boston. I would like to start with a brief background on my approach to art and where I think it lays roots. My generation, the generation of 80s kids, or Dahe Shasti Ha, were born and raised during the Iran-Iraq War in a very polarized culture. We dealt with social norms in different ends and at home and in the society, and the perfect recipe for nostalgia to be developed. Nostalgia, according to books, is pleasure and sadness combined that is caused by remembering the past and wishing that you could experience it again. This is the common realm I usually like to explore in my work as an artist, and it very much has deep roots in my subconscious when I'm working. One thing my generation shares in its subconscious is definitely a very strong coping mechanism. Experiencing the aftermaths of a hijacked revolution and dealing with the war through a child's lens makes anyone want to hold on to his or her good memories in order to wash away the bitter ones. Most of these memories for us are the cartoons we used to watch from the Iranian national TV during the war. Although after the revolution there was not much production in animation at that time in Iran, but the imported content that was mostly from Japan was very engaging for us kids. I also would like to talk about these animation productions that came from Japan and how they changed how we looked at our society and how we were developed as youth, and how the social media conductors made us engaged in that realm, and how we were engaged. So, just a brief history on animation. As some of you might know, just like many more real or fictional inventions of Iranians, animation has roots in Iran. I think about 5,000 years ago in Burnt City, Sistan Baluchistan province, they found a bull with a leaping goat trying to get the fruit from the tree. Although it's not animation, it's not in the modern term animation, but it's a sequential approach to optical illusion that creates that sort of movement that we call animation today. If you are interested, this was the leaping goat, and that is the bull. So I would like to link myself to an ancient animator in Iran. Who knows? Animation was more or less born in the early 20th century in the West. And when it was at its peak, the golden age of animation in the 50s, that's when animation came to Iran by artists like Esfandiar Ahmadiyeh, Morteza Mumayyiz, Farshid Meskhali, Ali Akbar Sadiqi, Dr. Zarim Kelk. At this time, they were mostly just experimenting with the medium, not much studying the filmmaking aspects or how you can engage the mass population with that medium. Although the years that they developed animation in Iran, they established a strong platform for animation to be considered an art form. But because of the heavy Eastern European influences they had, they didn't much lay a solid foundation for animation to work as an industry. And we're talking about 50s and 60s in Iran. The Institute for Intellectual Development of Children and Young Adults, or Kanun Parvarish Fikri, at that time was the main studio for animation production, and the contents created were mostly revolving dominance, hegemony, social structure, and this wasn't the right foundation for the youth to be engaged, although as fine artists, what they were doing was brilliant. Because of this weakness, if we call it a weakness, and the lack of hardware resources in Iran at that time, Iranian state TV couldn't produce animated series per demand. So what they needed to do was to import foreign animations and air them through either one of the two channels that we had in the 80s. At this time in the late 70s, early 80s, US and Japan were basically the pioneers. They were the dominant forces in the field. But because the political conflicts that we had with US and the value systems, the conflicts that we had, it wasn't possible to show American animation in Iran. But the Japanese counterparts were a great match. Now, what is really interesting is that although these series were attractive enough for engaging the youth in many countries outside of Iran, I mean, these cartoons from Japan were shown in France, all over in Europe, in South America, wherever they reached. But in Iran, the majority of the contents of these films were one way or another manipulated. First of all, most series selected had the protagonist of the story as an orphan, disabled, parentless, deserted, or exiled person. Secondly, according to the cultural norms, the contents were often censored or changed in the editing stages. I'm going to show you some of these series and briefly give you some examples. Those of you who are born in the 80s, I see smiles on your faces. I'm going to give you some chills, hearing the sounds and seeing these images. So I need to add that this might be interesting. So Nippon Studio in Japan was a famous studio producing animation at that time, early 70s. Some of their most famous animators were Miyazaki and Takahata. These guys later separated and created Studio Ghibli. That's the main Japanese studio right now producing animation. Finally, in the early 2000s, US decided to dub some of their animations, their feature animations, like Totoro. Actually, Totoro was a little bit earlier, but Spirited Away, Princess Mononoke. So it became popular in the US as well. But they were the backbone of this studio. They had a very famous series called the World Theater Series. They were mostly focusing on literature, classic novels, and that was the content for their animations. And they had really great animation, as you might know, it's a very meticulous job. It's time-consuming, and they were the masters at creating these characters within those environments and make them believable. That was the most important thing, making a character believable, and how you make a character appealing to the audience. So these guys were doing a great job, and the content would match the Iranian taste for youth. Let's go through some of these cartoons. This is Maya the Bee. We called this Nico Niku. They were looking for their mothers. They didn't have mothers. I'm not sure if they were siblings or not, but they were looking for a parent. That's one. Let's go on. This is Adventures of Hutch the honeybee. We call this Haj Zambura Asal. He was also looking for his mother. Because of this series, I'm terrified of insects. The Praying Mantis in this show was the villain. As a child, I created this humongous villain in my head. I remember in high school going back home, there was a praying mantis on top of the stairs. I couldn't go home. To this day, I'm afraid of them because of this series. Dunchak, or Pesar Shuja, his mom had died. Chubin, coming from a foreign planet, this guy was looking for his mom too. And there was an evil creature called Brumpa holding his mom away.
And the mom was censored.
Exactly. Oh, and that is true. The final episode, when we were all waiting to see what happens at the end, the whole episode was a mashup of just scenes without any narrative, because the dress the mom was wearing was inappropriate for TV. So we finally, we had to imagine and conclude it somehow for ourselves that this was a happy ending. Anyways, we had Swiss Family Robinson. This in Iran it was translated Khanwade Dr. Ernest. There was a shipwreck and they were isolated in an island, and they had to cope with the new system, the new environment. And it's really interesting that when I see this one, I was watching it the other day. It's kind of, they're always, all their dialogues is about hope. So they're living for hope, for a better situation for themselves. Maybe this was the same platform in Iran with us children after disaster, after the war, after the revolution, people wanting hope. So maybe. This one didn't involve orphans, so that was surprising. We have Sinbad, or in this case it was Arabian Nights, Adventures of Sinbad. He was also lost in the desert. Little Bits. There were many orphans in this series. We knew this series as Lily Pete. That's really interesting. It was changed. Story of Perrin. This was called Ba Khaneman. The translation is with a family, although she didn't have a family. So even with the title, they tried to change it a little bit. She was an orphan. Banner and Flappy. This was Banner the squirrel. It was an injured orphan squirrel. The owl character in this series, Amujok the Shakhtar, died trying to protect him at the end of the series. Ramkal, or Rascal the raccoon, injured orphan raccoon. This was a famous one. Daddy Longlegs, Baba Lengderaz, an orphan. Belle and Sebastian looking for his mom. Heidi, Girl at the Alps, orphan living with a grandfather. Even the soccer series that was really famous, the protagonist of the series didn't have a dad, and he had to deal not with having a dad in Japan, living with the mom. He had to get close to his uncle who came from Brazil in order to get that father figure in his life. So, and also there were many characters censored in this one as well because of a female character that was involved.
It turns out that it wasn't his uncle.
It wasn't. It was the mom's boyfriend.
It was the mom's
exactly.
boyfriend.
Thank you for that. Chatri, Girl of the Meadows, an orphan. Story of the Alps, Maya Annette. This was a famous one. There were orphans, obviously, but it's interesting that the original soundtrack for this series was also changed. It was changed to a score by Majid Intizami, played with Santur, I guess to make a better nostalgic effect on the kids. Just to give you that chill, the 80s kids here. Oh, now, what's important is that however they could, these conductors for the social media, at that time engaged the kids. So we know that. With these creations, they hooked us in. But aside from that, they were trying to prepare the children in case they get hit by a disaster. Whether it was becoming an orphan, losing a home, or simply experiencing the war. It was a very manipulating tactic, but it worked. So it gives me the chills. So this is the soundtrack part. This was inserted. This is not the original soundtrack, but it was changed to make a better effect on the kids at that time because it made it more I have excerpts from some of these cartoons, and I want to show you mostly how in their dreams they realize that they have a parent. Now, it's the wartime. It's understandably many parents were lost, or mostly father figures, and I'm going to talk about that in the Iranian-made animations. But still, now that we're adults, we're dealing with these effects of these type of I don't want to call it corruption in the system, in the media system, but it affected us. Huge. It had a huge effect. You might not think that they had the effect, but most of my generation's nightmares, fears, and stipulations are heavily intertwined with these memories and stories. One of my earliest memories is when I remember watching a show called Serendipity in the Ekbatan complex, and the sirens went off for the missile attacks, and the show was cut off, and we had to run away, or the TV went blank, and there was the siren. So that is one of my earliest memories of the war. Let's take a look at.
هاج زنبور اصل مادر بیا اینجا با من بیا میخوام تو رو ببرم به یه باغ پر از گل باشه
شناخته همه چیز زیباست کلا و سرندیپیتی هم که بهشون اجازه داده شده تو این جزیره بمونن مثل همه اهالی از زندگی در اونجا لذت میبرن
Kid having the nightmare of losing their parent. But it was normalized for us. It was crystallized in our heads that this might happen. It was something normal. Now I talk to my students, and their problems is very different than what we experienced. Maybe it made us better people. I don't know.
کردم و به اینجا اومدم زندگی در اونجا برام قابل تحمل نبود دیگه نمیتونستم اونجا بمونم بنابراین اومدم اینجا
This guy escaped from a different planet. Now it's on Earth. I'm looking for his mom. So the whole series was about him.
نه اینطور نیست من اومدم اینجا
We had also Iranian series that were attempts. It was animation, kind of like photo montages, sequential photo montages that we called animation in Iran, and it followed the same principle of a kid losing a parent. In this case, Ali Kuchulu. This kid lost his dad in the war. Probably this was why one of the very few Iranian-made animations in this series that it was a successful one, because although he felt sad for this kid not having a dad around, in every episode he was dealing with this issue. It was engaging. Outside of our homes, mostly for us, so my class of living. Outside of home, this was going on at school, in the street. For many, they were involved with this every day. They lost them, so it even was more engaging. Move a little bit further to the Iranian animation industry. After the war, and during the time the country was reconstructing itself, the same system was in place for the state TV until the mid-90s, when the satellites came into the scene. At this time, the role of the state TV was a little bit diluted because the generation was changing, and in need for more updated content. What I remember watching was American-made Cartoon Network series, but again, I was the minority. For the majority of the kids, it was still the state TV. In the late 90s and the early 2000s, Iranian studios started to gain some momentum through government-funded budgets to produce Iranian animations with Iranian content. At this time, there were 4 major studios. Qanun, which was the major one from before the revolution, Hur, Resane Fard, and Saba, all connected to the government. All operating under the state budget with heavy content control. In one of my visits to Qanun, maybe 8-9 years ago, I met a filmmaker. I think his film was 10 minutes. So 10 minutes, every minute is 60 seconds, every second is 24 frames for film, about 12 drawings. So it was about 6,000, 7,000 drawings, right, to make this film. One of the tools that the main character was using was a comb, just to comb the hair. It resembled a Jewish symbol, so it was censored. So that he had to go back, change every frame to not portray something that might resemble a Jewish symbol. So it is still heavily controlled in the studios, although they're creating great films, mostly short films, but because they can basically maneuver around these censors. With TV series, it's different. They need a big budget to create these series. It's not just one film you create, it's 5 minutes. And it's hard to maneuver around these censorship laws or figures that watch over what you create. So at that time, in the early 2000s, they started to explore with projects revolving around the religious contents. Stories from Quran, from prophets, imams, and this was definitely an unsuccessful attempt because the kids were simply not interested. The second attempt was to focus on mythical stories of Middle East and Iran, such as the story of Jamshid, Zahak, Gashasp. But again, the result was not noteworthy because the kids don't get the education in the school system on the mythical stories in Iran, the mythical history of Iran, mythology of Iran. I don't remember any mythology in my education in Iran. I don't know if I'm mistaken. Please correct me. But it was an attempt. The kids couldn't make a connection to their identity with these characters. So that was also, although it was getting better, I think it was a failed attempt. More than the mythical stories of the East, of Iran, kids got to know more about the Western mythology because Western studios had the resources, had the technology, the fancy visuals, so they engaged the kids more in their own storytelling traditions. Most kids after my generation know Hercules better than Gashas per se. And it's because of the fancy, entertaining technical abilities of the Western counterparts. The third attempt, and this is only about a decade ago, came when personal computers got far more advanced and Iranian animators could at least do a better job technically. In order to pull in some audiences. The content for this third attempt was based on Iranian folk stories that are transferred orally. And we have this tradition from many thousand years ago in Iran. I got to learn about our oral traditional storytellings through music, because that's a part of our music. Some are written, some are not. Musiqi maqami, the folk music is mostly, we call it chest to chest. So you sit down in front of your master, he plays, you play. He plays, you play, until you get that story. So that's how it's transferred. So the kids had the ear for that type of story, and the technical parts were better. They were improved, but still there was a problem. The content. The content was really clean and proper. So one famous project is actually Shekaristan. This was a really well-known project, I think in the 2003 or 4 in Iran. The character design is great. The stories are solid, but after watching a couple of episodes, you lose interest as a teenager, as the young generation in Iran, because still it's controlled. You feel that you don't have space to maneuver as a kid, being creative, being imaginative. So this was the third attempt, and now we have the internet. So after the internet's entrance in Iran, and with faster connections, artists and filmmakers started to produce web-based work to be seen without any content control from the government. Currently, there are several projects that are very popular, mostly on the social media platforms. A good example is Dirin Dirin. This project was started as a web series, but found its way into the state TV after its popularity in the social media. There's a controlled version of this series in the state TV channels, but still, it has many followers. Younger generations are following it. Older generations are. It's about everyday life in Iran and the issues that everyday life creates for one. Let's watch an episode. For those of you who, and this is in Farsi, I'm going to explain what's going on.
این یک اسکناس در دوران بی‌سر و سامانیان است. این سالمند قصد خرید روزانه است. سلام فروش کننده. سلام ای خرنده. آن نان چند است؟ به یک چندرغاز است ای سالمند. اوه چقدر گزاف می باشد. لابد این فراورده های لبنی چند است؟ 2.5 غاز است ای سالمند. ای بابام بنابراین محصولات پروتئینی چند است؟ 200 چندرغاز کامل ناقابل. من تنها نیم چندر بدون غاز دارم. آخر من با این چون کنم؟ فی الحال بی حساب شدیم. یک بار جواب سلام دادم، 3 بار هم قیمت گفتم که روی هم می شود نیم درغاز. به هر حال مرگ حق است، چه از سالمندی چه از
How much is the bread? This much. How much is the milk? That much. You owe some money.
مأموره آب
Got the
هستم.
money. That's it. Simple as that, and that's everyday life in Iran. It's just within the dialogues how this humor is working with the younger generation, and for some reason it engages them. But also there are other films that are being produced by artists, filmmakers outside of Iran. This particular one caught my eye. It's made in France by Sarah Saidan. It's a short film. It's 15-16 minutes long, but it's worth it. It has subtitles, and I want you guys to see it because it's a very important film. It's about nostalgia. It's about a kid from my generation making a film about Iran, outside of Iran. It's my story. If I could make this film, I would. I couldn't. I didn't have the talent. She has something going on, and I want you guys to watch it. And I got the rights to show this film. I mean, this is a very, very simple story. It has a beginning, middle, and end. It has its protagonist, antagonist, the twist, and a conclusion. But just by doing this, you identify with the character, the antagonist, that is simplified. But this character, because it's more stylized, automatically you push it back. It's an object, it's an external object. So now I'm going to get to this why we designed the Rostam character in my series this way. This is not something that we invented, but let me show you something. So I can do this. Right? So it doesn't really matter what tool I use. I have this character in my head. We don't see with our eyes, we see with this pile of meat up here. So knowing your character is really important, and making the character believable is really important. This is the character I know. So I can identify with this character. It's in my head. These are just tools. Right? So we're talking about how character design can work and can help out. And I'm going to get to this when we get to Rostam, this guy. And we had a big debate with my friend and colleague, Surush Rezai. We had so many conversations back and forth on how we should do this character. Should we do a stylized version or we should do a simple one? And we concluded on something like that. Make it more simplified so the audience can better relate to the character, devoid of any style, devoid of any form. It's just about the content. Okay? I'm just going to give you more information about this series. So, as I said, I migrated to US in 2000 after high school. I was not into mythology at all. I was not into Persian traditional music at all. It was all about nostalgia. All about nostalgia. This is understandable, going back to the roots and trying to find out where you are when you're split in half between a culture that it's US and a culture that is Iran. So trying to find yourself within your culture. I started to study Shahnameh, just reading Shahnameh, Book of Kings by Ferdowsi, and other scripts from ancient Iran. And finally, after 4 or 5 years of just studying these scripts and these books, and from in any forms or medium, from the book itself or to the documentaries, to films, just trying to find out, trying to make that connection to the identity. I concluded 2 exhibitions. One was called Pahlavan. It was about the heroes of Shahnameh and how they try to... it was about their struggles within, about them being patriots, them being heroes, fighting for a country or for a land. And the second one was this series. It was called 7 Conquests of Story. It wasn't about the stories of Shahnameh at all. These paintings were shown in Tehran, and the main goal for me was to have a dialogue about storytelling rather than telling the stories themselves. I wanted to create a dialogue about the stories and develop conversations and why these stories survived the 7 conquests of history or time. How these storytelling traditions were transferred generation by generation. Why they survived more than anything else. It was basically an improvisation in an abstract form, abstract visuals on how I can tell these stories, but they're mine. They're not anybody else's. If that makes any sense. So this is Rostam and Sohrab. They were shown in Tehran. There were a lot of conversation about them with the audiences. This is 7 Conquests of Rostam. Rostam and Esfandiar, and you also created an installation for this exhibition and let the audience interact with the story by manipulating or not manipulating, if they decided, the story based on their identity and beliefs. This was a study on why people tend to change a story regardless of the creator's intention. So when let's say Ferdowsi gathered, the author of Book of Kings, he gathered these stories, added to them, decided which ones are the right ones, or the ones that he wanted to portray in his book. But then, like any other book from the ancient times, it goes through additions. People come in, they think this part is not right, so they try to change it. So this installation was about whether you would do this or not. It was really interesting. Many people decided to change it. We had one of the poems by Ferdowsi up there and extra words around it, and we let people change the words if they wanted to, based on contemporary life, whether on modern life. Most people did. We invited Mahmoud Dolatabadi to come and see this installation. I think he was the only person who said, I don't want to change it. For whatever reason he said, it's fine, however it is, just let it be. And it was a really interesting experience. So, at this time, I got to know Surush Rezai. He's now a celebrity in Iran, very popular with his animated films. It's mostly satire, what he does. Many times we had clashes, conflicts over the content that we created for the series, for the Rostam in Wonderland series, because I wanted it to be more neat, more proper. He wanted to go crazy. We met, this is him. He has many popular animated series of his own. We met in a workshop in Tehran. It's interesting that I was going back to my roots, trying to learn about Iranian mythology and stories and folklore and everything, and he was doing the opposite. He was working on Looney Tunes and Merry Melodies and Warner Brothers animation. So it was a nice collaboration with him. And I mentioned that I would like to bring Rostam to a contemporary setup, and because I wasn't living in Iran for several years, I needed him to be my filter, but also, more importantly, the plot generator, because I wasn't there, although I was trying to keep myself familiarized with what was going on in the news and the social practices within the youth culture, but he was living it, and he's a very smart artist and very sensitive one to his social environment. So that was our collaboration. We started with designs that were a little bit different than the original one. We developed the content we needed to develop content revolving around the sanctions, the economic issues, racism in Iran, and these are subjects that are not usually dealt with within the youth culture. Characters needed to be believable, connectable, and vessels for self-identifying. That's why we decided to go from a very stylized design to a very simple one. Almost childish approach visually, to the point that the series is completely devoid of form, but considerate in content. We needed to create a realm that the audience could enjoy nostalgia, but be present at the same time. And that was the main goal. I would like to show the first episode and the last episode for this show. And we can wrap up this talk with questions and answers if you want. Sorry about the audio problem that we have here. This is the first episode about sanctions, the medical sanctions. All right, so I'm going to skip. I'm going to skip the last episode. You can find it online because Dr. Milani told me we're. So we went through all those shallow jokes and all those satire just for the end, to talk about the sanctions. That's all the effect we wanted. So it's really tricky. It's very sensitive. We finished 5 episodes, each different. But the most interesting part of this project was how people interacted with us in social media. That was very educational. The last episode is about racism in Iran against Afghans. We had about 2,000 comments, just people going at each other, talking about race and them showing off how they're not racist. So I think that conversation was, at the end, a good conclusion for this project. I'm here for any questions. Yes?
I have a question about the system in Iran. Of course, this is posted on social media. You said you bypass. In case you want to make something like this for the general population on television, do you have to first run it by an official? I mean, you have to send it to an organization that looks at it?
First, you need to go through, you need to talk to a studio if you have a project. They have their own authorities, and then also they have their own authorities. So it's a very complicated structure. Here, it's mostly whether it sells or not in the studios. Over there, it's mostly about the content and if it sells. It's funny, with the budget that, I think it's about 60 million for animation per year. It's not a small budget, although half of it needs to be provided by advertisement. So it's a very tricky project if you want to get into it. Usually they don't get any permits to do that.
Now, are you able to make money out of this? Because I'm sure you would like to.
Not really. I don't. But my colleague Surush, he makes advertisement on social media mostly for companies.
And these are found on YouTube?
Yes. It's Rostam in Wonderland. You'll find.
Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. My question is, I understand why the Iranian government was looking for orphan cartoons. I don't understand why Japanese made these.
They didn't. They had the World Theater Series. Within those, they had probably about 50, 60 series. The Iranian state TV chose about 15, 20 that they found suitable for Iran. And also they changed it. So it was, whoever did it wisely and with the purpose.
How did these books and stories survive in thousands of years?
The Shahnameh?
How did it survive? I mean, there wasn't a print shop there.
Well, we always had older versions that were kept for a long time. But also, the most important thing. This is the lesson I learned from my music teacher. He's a Kurd. He plays tambur. I asked for a long time. I was telling him, why don't you bring this music out of Kermanshah and this isolated area? And he said, we don't need to. If it's strong enough, it's going to survive on its own. If it doesn't, then it doesn't. So these books like Shahnameh or any other book that survived, aside from attacks of foreigners or the governments wanting to burn something down so it doesn't exist anymore, I believe they survived mostly because it had an audience. It still has an audience. I was probably a 20-year-old immigrant in the United States from Iran, still going back to see what they were talking about. So, should have been a powerful project. Yes.
Thank you for this talk. One of the things that I noticed about the animations that Iranian are making is the main audience for those are the Iranian living in Iran, or probably they have already immigrated.
Mm-hmm.
For example, the last recent animation that you showed,
The short film.
The
Rostam
in Wonderland.
That's for Iranians.
I'm sure that most part of it was not understandable for,
Exactly.
For my American family here.
Exactly.
So I wonder if there is any effort making more international-based animations.
It can be, yes. The other film, the short film that I showed by Sara Saidan, it is a very international film. The content is relatable. This one is not, but it's made for a different purpose. So
because even the slangs that
exactly, it's not translation would be awful. It's just really hard. Thank you very much.